want to pause for just a moment to let the music we just heard sink in a little bit. That piece was written by Rhiannon Giddens, obviously performed there with Yo-Yo Ma. That was just released on June 19th this year. So this morning we have heard the words of our country's Declaration of Independence. We have heard the words of Frederick Douglass in 1852 from his speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." And then we just heard some words from Isabel Wilkerson, a journalist and a scholar. She said these words in 2016, and I want to say them again before I tell you a story. So Isabel Wilkerson, in an interview in 2016, said, "Our country is like a really old house. I love old houses. I've always lived in old houses, but old houses need a lot of work, and the work is never done." And that's what our country is like. You may not want to go into that basement, but if you really don't go into that basement, it's at your own peril. And I think that whatever you are ignoring is not going to go away. Whatever you're ignoring is only going to get worse. Whatever you're ignoring will be there to be reckoned with until you reckon with it. And I think that's what we're called upon to do where we are right now. So a story this morning. In 2002, 130 elderly African Americans received checks for $215 each from an organization called Tulsa Metropolitan Ministries. More checks were to come as money was raised. In that first effort, over $20,000 of the fund came directly from the Unitarian Universalist Association or UU congregations in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was the beginning of a long overdue and still never fully funded reparations program. Even though a public commission had been formed and recommended reparations, churches, not just Unitarian Universalist churches, but communities of faith in Tulsa decided to stop waiting, decided that they would lead the way as an example. And it is true that UU congregations in Tulsa were feeling particularly responsible and accountable to this call for reparations. Now, why were these reparation payments happening? Some of you know this history, others of you might not. Almost 100 years ago, in 1921, the Tulsa Race Massacre happened. White people attacked the Black community of Tulsa, and before it was all over, in the span of 24 hours, more than 35 square blocks of homes and schools and churches and businesses were completely destroyed. The Red Cross estimated that around 300 people were killed. At the time of the riot and massacre, this community in Tulsa, this Black community, was the wealthiest Black community in the United States. It was also known as Black Wall Street. Some of you might have learned a little bit about this history around the time of our President Donald Trump's recent visit to Tulsa. The damage done in these 24 hours, if you look at it in today's monetary terms, equaled millions and millions of dollars. And no one had ever been compensated for that loss. Now, why would the UU churches in Tulsa feel especially responsible for leading the way on paying some kind of reparations? Well, we could talk about that on two levels. The first, perhaps kind of more obvious level, if we don't know the history, is that, of course, our religious commitments would lead us to be a part of this effort. We have a history of siding with the marginalized, of doing our work to examine privileges among us, of affirming the worth and dignity of all people. It's core to who we say we are. But the second level, the second reason why UU churches would feel especially responsible is not obvious unless you know the history. You see, in 1921, one of the main newspapers in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Tulsa Tribune, was owned and published by a Unitarian from a very prominent Unitarian family. His name was Richard Lloyd Jones. His father, Jenkins Lloyd Jones, was a Unitarian minister and had founded All Souls Church in Chicago. And he had been a significant part of the expansion of Unitarianism in the Midwest during the 1800s. Now, son Richard, who owns the paper, was not a minister, but nonetheless, he also played a role in founding the All Souls Unitarian Church in Tulsa, which today is one of the largest Unitarian Universalist congregations in our whole association. On May 31st, 1921, the Tulsa Tribune published a story describing an alleged assault of a young white woman by a Black teenager named Dick Rowland. And the editorial of that same issue described a plan by white Tulsans to gather in order to capture and to lynch this same teenage boy. Many, including the chief of detectives for Tulsa at the time, attributed the subsequent violence that evening, that very evening, to the sensationalist reporting of the newspaper. Dick Rowland was protected and held in safety and was eventually acquitted of these charges. Turns out, friends, that no copy of that editorial exists today. It was removed from the archives of the Tribune and the state archives from any official records. Are we willing to go into the basement? The Tulsa UU churches, along with support from the UUA, were attempting to pay some sort of reparations for this history. At the time, in 2002, I believe it was only the second time in US history that compensation payments had been made for victims of racist violence. Checks for $215 to elderly people, after many of the survivors had already died. To date, 2019, the full recommendations by a public commission for government to pay reparations to the victims of the Tulsa massacre have still never been implemented. In fact, just in May of this year, Human Rights Watch, which tracks human rights abuses around the world, issued a report on the Tulsa massacre and its aftermath. And I want to read you a quote from that report. Again, this was published in May of this year. Under international human rights law, governments have an obligation to provide effective remedies for violations of human rights. The fact that a government abdicated its responsibility nearly 100 years ago and continued to do so in subsequent years does not absolve it of that responsibility today, especially when failure to address the harm and related action and inaction results in further harm, as it has in Tulsa. Like so many other places across the United States marred by similar incidents of racial violence, these harms stem from the legacy of slavery, end quote. With the recent horrific death of George Floyd, sparking uprisings around this country, it seems like there may finally be a broader mass awakening in this country, particularly among white folks, to the ongoing daily oppression of Black people and other people of color. I read the other day that a new poll shows that suddenly just over 70% of white Americans now believe that racial discrimination is a quote unquote big problem in this country. Just a few years ago, it was a little more than half of white Americans. So seeing this number of 71% led some political scientists to think that somehow the poll was flawed. They had to go back and recheck it. But it's real. So in this current moment of movement and some level of awakening, we have finally seen some swift actions, for instance, to remove the public celebration of the Confederacy from public spaces. Statues of Confederate generals have been taken down. The state of Mississippi voted to remove the Confederate flag from their state flag. And right here in East Tennessee, some of y'all know, there's a group of alumni of Maryville High School who are lobbying to remove the name Rebels as the Maryville High School mascot. This is important. This is important cultural change, and I am not here to critique it. Symbols and culture matter. They matter to how safe people feel moving through a community. And they matter especially for young people as they see in public spaces who this country is meant to be for, right? But as many people have pointed out, it generally does not cost our local or federal government much to remove a monument or to change the name of a mascot. Symbolic change is a really good step. Cultural change is important, but it does not change the day-to-day lives of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in this country. To really create change in this country, we have to wake up to the deep, long, ongoing presence of what Isabel Wilkerson and Michelle Alexander and many others have labeled our caste system, one that keeps generational poverty in place. I want to share a statistic with you from a new study out from Duke University. Today, the average Black family with children holds just 1 cent of wealth for every dollar that the average white family with children holds. I'm going to repeat that. Today, the average Black family with children holds just 1 cent of wealth. We're talking about wealth, accumulated assets. 1 cent of wealth for every dollar that the average white family with children holds. We remember this morning that Black families endured 12 generations of slavery in this country. 12 generations, where by and large, they were not allowed to accumulate any kind of property, possessions, or wealth. Journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones writes in this last week, and I quote her, "At the time of the Civil War, the value of the enslaved human beings held as property added up to more than all of this nation's railroads and factories combined. And yet enslaved people saw not a dime of this wealth. They owned nothing and were owed nothing from all that had been built from their toil." End quote. The kind of awakening we have seen the past few months doesn't happen out of thin air. It comes after years of organizing and consistent, persistent work in communities all around the country, including ours. Hundreds and even thousands of people showing up for vigils or a march in Blount County, supporting the affirmation that Black Lives Matter doesn't just happen. Even when there's horrific, outrageous actions filmed on tape, right? Recorded for all to see. The work of Blount County United and the local NAACP, some of our faith communities in the Blount County chapter of Showing Up for Racial Justice, all of these groups have been working for years, and other groups before them, working to raise consciousness, to uncover layers of history, and to connect people's hearts, especially the hearts of white folks, to something larger than ourselves, a larger vision for what it means to be human, a larger circle of compassion for the human experience, and a larger sense of the need for confession, repentance, and repair. And isn't that, my friends, isn't that one way to describe why to engage in a spiritual practice, or what a spiritual practice is for? To raise our consciousness, to uncover the depths, to connect our hearts to something larger than ourselves, to something transcendent, whether that be values, whether that be a sense of being held by something greater in this universe, whether that be the call of God. Something that helps us understand a larger vision for what it means to be human, and how we can hold one another across difference in a larger circle of compassion. And isn't spiritual practice about practices of confession, repentance, and repair? Anything. I think spiritual practices are anything that help us see the truth about ourselves and others more clearly. And paradoxically, to both accept that truth, even the stuff that we don't like, right? While at the same time working to transform that stuff into something more kind and loving and free. We accept and we transform. Now, we UUs aren't known for talking a whole lot about confession and repentance. Too many of us have been scarred by that language in more fundamentalist traditions, but I think if we are to face honestly and be healing agents for our country, then we might need to reclaim the spiritual practices of collective confession and repentance as steps towards true repair or reparations. Confession accepts the ways we fall short of our ideals. Repentance means we seek to transform it. Reparation means we act on that transformed heart in real, concrete, tangible ways. You can call it confession or you can call it acceptance. If confession doesn't work for you, you can call it repentance or call it transformation if that word repentance doesn't work for you. Whatever you call it, the practice isn't done until the repair or the reparations take place. We need some collective spiritual practices that take us deep into the basement of the house of our country. For some of us, deep into the basement of the house of our families, to see and accept and confess the hard stuff. And we need practices of repentance, of surrendering to transformation, of giving some things up for the greater good, perhaps even to give up the best rooms in the house. And then we've got to repair the foundations, the ones we really don't want to look at. And that includes the persistent and huge racial wealth gap in this country that is a legacy, not just of racial violence in things that happened like the Tulsa Race Massacre, but the generations of violence that happened to enslaved people in this country. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes in his article, The Case for Reparations, he writes this, quote, "What is needed is an airing of family secrets, a settling with old ghosts. What is needed is a healing of the American psyche and the banishment of white guilt. What I'm talking about is more than recompense for past injustices, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. What I'm talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal." A national reckoning like that will cost us something. And I don't mean that symbolically. I want to give you one example I know of. In addition to the reparations example that I told you earlier, happening in Tulsa, I know one faith-based organization that has a commitment to pay a reparational payment of 26.7% to all contractors and employees who are descended from African people who were enslaved in the United States and the Caribbean. They say this percentage reflects the median wage gap. Here we're talking about income, not wealth. This percentage, 26.7%, reflects the median wage gap between Black and white Americans, according to the Economic Policy Institute. And our own Unitarian Universalist Association has had a commission on institutional change working for 3 years. They just published a big report that I'm still processing and spending time with. It includes a section on reparations and restoration, which says in part, our limited scope of history means that we have not been restored to the wholeness that comes from a true accounting for the ways that our faith has been complicit in the oppression of Black people, Indigenous people, and poor people, as well as other people of color. They say the Commission's work affirms that reparations within Unitarian Universalism are imperative to both fulfilling the values of the second principle, which affirms and promotes justice, equity, and compassion, and it is imperative to achieving the goal of a beloved community. Resources need to be redirected, it says. So in this coming year, I am thinking about how we as a congregation can engage more deeply and more fully the range of recommendations from our own Unitarian Universalist Association as a part of our collective spiritual practice. I want us to spend some time going into the basement, accepting and confessing, repenting and transforming in the name of wholeness, in the name of more love and liberty for us all. You know, y'all, despite everything right now, I actually, and I can truly say this, actually feel more hopeful for true change to upend systems of racial oppression than I have in a while. I think it's because the door to the nation's basement has been opened for some people in a way that it hasn't been for a really long time, or maybe ever. It's up to those of us who are identified as white and benefit from the privileges that that bestows to keep going down into the basement, to go further and further, to keep asking hard questions, having conversations, and to stay in the collective practice of keeping that door open. The collective practice of really looking at the cracks in the foundations of our country. And to keep working as a spiritual practice on this old, imperfect house of ours. I don't know about you, I do love this house. I do. And to me, this July 4th weekend, I think that is the most patriotic commitment we can make, to do our part, our small part, to repair the foundations of this country in order that we can form a more perfect union here in the United States. Just like living in an old house, the work will never be complete. It will never be complete. And I want to invite you to think about that as a place of freedom to act. We don't have to figure it all out before we act. We don't have to reach enlightenment before we practice. We just have to keep practicing. We all have our part to play. So let's stay at it, and we can do it together. And for that, I'm so grateful. Let's stay at it, friends. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.